For decades, the Dominican Republic printed a specific word on every citizen's national identity card to describe their race: indio, indigenous. The government made this official, mandatory, stamped onto the paperwork every adult in the country was required to carry. There was just one problem. The population the word claimed to describe was already gone. Genetics now shows what the identity card refused to. The ancestry the state erased from the record is the largest one Dominicans actually carry. The Taíno population of Hispaniola, the island the Dominican Republic shares with Haiti, was functionally destroyed within decades of Spanish arrival in 1492, wiped out by disease, forced labor, and violence. At a scale historians consider one of the fastest demographic collapses in the history of colonization. Spain responded by importing enslaved Africans to the island almost immediately, making Hispaniola one of the earliest and longest-running sites of the transatlantic slave trade anywhere in the Americas. By the time the Dominican Republic became an independent nation in 1844, its population carried centuries of African ancestry built directly into its genetic and cultural foundation. That's not a disputed detail. It's the basic demographic history of the country. What happened next was a deliberate act of national reinvention. Following independence, and especially under the dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo from 1930 to 1961, Dominican state ideology built national identity around the claim that Dominicans descended primarily from Spanish colonists and indigenous Taíno ancestors, actively distancing the country's self-image from Africa. The government formalized this by stamping indio directly onto national identity cards as an official racial category, a term most Dominicans still carry on that paperwork today. This wasn't simply a preference for one word over another. It was national policy, reinforced through decades of state messaging that positioned Dominican identity in direct contrast to neighboring Haiti, whose population was cast as the country's real black population by comparison. The Parsley Massacre of 1937, in which Trujillo's forces killed thousands of Haitians and Dominicans of Haitian descent along the border, stands as the most violent expression of that same ideological project. Given how central the indio identity became to Dominican national self-understanding, official, printed, government-mandated for generations, you'd expect a genetic study of the Dominican population to at least partially validate it, showing a population with a meaningfully large indigenous genetic component to match the label the state insisted on using. Before we get to the actual numbers, it's worth sitting with just how confident that assumption should feel. This isn't folklore competing against science. This is a government literally printing an ancestry claim onto identity documents for the entire adult population. If any national identity myth in this series deserved the benefit of the doubt going in, it was this one. The data says otherwise, decisively. A 2016 study by the National Geographic Society's Genographic Project found the Dominican population to be 49% African, 39% European, and just 4% Indigenous American. A separate academic analysis of Dominican genetic ancestry using 90 informative ancestry markers across nearly 200 participants found a broadly similar pattern. European ancestry around 52%, African ancestry around 39.5%, and indigenous ancestry under 9%. Across every rigorous study conducted, the same conclusion holds. Indigenous ancestry sits in the single digits. African ancestry consistently ranks as either the largest or second largest component of the Dominican genome, nowhere close to the marginal footnote the identity card system implied. Here's a question worth sitting with, because it's the one that actually matters. If the genetic reality was always this clear, why did an entire nation's official paperwork insist on a different word for generations? The answer isn't a gap in the science. It's a gap that was engineered on purpose. State-directed racial classification isn't neutral data collection. It's a tool, and Dominican elites used the indio category specifically because it let mixed-race Dominicans, the actual majority of the population, distance themselves from blackness without claiming to be fully European either, a racial middle ground invented explicitly to avoid the word African. Calling the population indigenous wasn't a genetic claim at all. It was a political solution to a problem the government had already decided the truth couldn't solve. If a government inventing an entire racial category just to avoid saying the word African out loud is the kind of institutional sleight of hand that gets you fired up, say so in the comments, because the Afro-Dominican identity movement has been making exactly this argument for years, and now has the genome to back it decisively. Tell us if you've encountered a national identity built more on what a government wanted to be true than on what its own people's DNA actually says, because that gap keeps turning out to be one of the most reliable places this channel finds its next story. The comparison to Haiti, sharing the very same island, makes the contrast even sharper. Haiti's national identity has always centered African ancestry openly, born from the only successful slave revolution in recorded history, and built on unambiguous pride in that African-descended founding population. The Dominican Republic, occupying the other half of the same landmass, shaped by the same colonial slave trade, carrying comparable, or in some measures even higher African ancestry by the numbers, built its national identity around erasing that exact same inheritance instead. Two nations, one island, one shared genetic starting point, two entirely opposite decisions about which ancestry to claim out loud and which one to bury under an official identity card. It's worth adding some texture to what those genetic numbers translate to at the level of specific regional origins, because a figure this large still resolves into particular documented source regions once researchers look closer. Individual Dominican genetic ancestry results consistently show significant contributions from Cameroon, Congo, and the broader southern Bantu-speaking region, along with Benin, Togo, and smaller but still meaningful contributions from Mali, the Ivory Coast, Ghana, and Nigeria, a spread reflecting the specific West and Central African ports the transatlantic slave trade drew from during Hispaniola's centuries as an active colonial slaving hub. This regional specificity matters because it confirms the African ancestry showing up in Dominican genomes isn't some vague, unplaceable signal. It traces to the same documented ports and peoples this channel has profiled across a dozen other populations, evidence that fits cleanly into the broader historical record of the transatlantic trade rather than floating free of it. It's worth being precise about how the indio classification system actually functioned in practice, because it wasn't simply a matter of one word appearing on paperwork. Dominican identity documents historically used a graduated scale of skin tone categories, indio claro and indio oscuro among them, light indigenous and dark indigenous, a system explicitly designed to describe visibly African-descended people using indigenous terminology rather than admitting what the underlying ancestry actually was. A Dominican citizen with clearly African features, dark skin, and documented African ancestry going back generations could still be officially processed and categorized as some shade of Indio rather than Negro or Moreno, terms the system deliberately avoided applying except in the most extreme cases. This wasn't a linguistic accident or a case of imprecise folk categories evolving naturally over time. It was a specific bureaucratic mechanism built to root an entire population's visible African ancestry through a different, more politically acceptable label, one card at a time, one citizen at a time, for the better part of a century. The consequences of that system extended well beyond individual identity documents into how the Dominican Republic collected and reported its own demographic data at the national level. Census categories, school records, and even some medical intake forms inherited the same indio-centered framework, meaning an entire nation's official statistics on its own racial composition were, for generations, built on a classification system explicitly designed not to accurately count what the population actually was. Researchers studying Dominican demographic history have noted that this makes historical Dominican census data on race functionally unreliable as a measure of actual ancestry, a stark admission that the numbers a government collected about its own people for the better part of a century were never designed to be accurate in the first place, only politically convenient. This is where the genetic research does something historical census data never could. It bypasses the classification system entirely. DNA doesn't know what word a government printed on an identity card. It doesn't respond to state ideology, national mythology, or a century of officially sanctioned discomfort with a specific ancestral label. It simply is what it is, inherited directly and mechanically from parent to child, regardless of what box a bureaucrat checked. That's precisely why the gap between the indio identity card and the 49% African genome reads as so stark. One system was built by people with a political incentive to shape the answer. The other system has never once had an incentive of any kind. It just carries the information forward, generation after generation, whether or not anyone in power wanted to look at it. For Afro-Dominicans today, a growing movement has spent the past 2 decades pushing back directly against the indio classification, organizing around Black Dominican identity, challenging the identity card system itself, and pointing to exactly the kind of genetic evidence this research now confirms. Natural hair movements, Afro-Dominican cultural festivals, and public campaigns to remove indio from official documents have all gained momentum, specifically because the genetic data finally gives the movement something the state can't argue around: a number. Scholars and activists leading this push have pointed specifically to studies like the Geographic Project's findings as concrete evidence in a debate that, for most of the 20th century, had nothing but competing cultural narratives to draw on. Where earlier generations of Afro-Dominican advocates could point only to appearance, oral history, and cultural retention, this generation can point to a peer-reviewed percentage, a shift that has measurably changed the terms of the conversation in classrooms, museums, and public discourse across the country over the past decade. What the Dominican Republic proves, as decisively as any population this channel has covered, is that a national identity built by a government isn't the same thing as a national identity confirmed by biology. Trujillo's regime had the power to print a word on a card. It never had the power to change what that card's holders actually carried in their DNA. The identity document said indio for generations. The genome, the entire time, was saying something else, waiting for the moment someone with a lab instead of a printing press finally checked. A card can carry a word for as long as a government insists on printing it. It was never going to carry the truth for longer than the DNA underneath it was willing to stay quiet.